The patient's last hope wasn't medicine. It was a lion, a dying man, a starving lion, and a bond so unbreakable it defied every rule of nature. When a hospice patient whispered one last wish, no one expected a full-grown lion to walk the hospital halls at 2 a.m. But what happened when they brought the two back together, after years apart, left everyone speechless. The sky over Silver Creek was still a soft gray when Dr. Emily Hart unlocked the side entrance of the medical center, her breath shaping small clouds in the cold morning air. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours, but the quiet before sunrise always grounded her. It was the one moment of the day when the halls were calm, the machines silent, and she could prepare herself for what waited beyond each hospital door. She slipped into her office, set down her coffee, and was about to open her first chart when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number from the mountains west of town. She considered letting it ring, but something about the early hour made her answer. "This is Dr. Hart." The voice on the other end carried both exhaustion and urgency. "Emily, it's Joshua Reed, Mountain Haven Wildlife Refuge." She straightened in her chair. She only knew Joshua through a few veterinary consultations years back, but she had never heard him sound like this. "Joshua, is everything all right?" There was a pause, long enough to unsettle her, before he spoke again. "No, not even close. We have a situation with one of our lions. His name is Cairo." Emily frowned. "Is he injured?" "I wish it were that simple," Joshua said quietly. "He's refusing to eat, completely. It's been 4 days." Her medical instincts sharpened. 4 days? That's dangerous. Has he been checked? Is there infection, fever, neurological symptoms? "No," Joshua interrupted. "He's physically healthy, but he's shutting down. He won't respond to keepers. He won't drink unless we coax him. He barely moves from the front of his enclosure." Emily rubbed her temple. "Lions don't just shut down, Joshua. What changed?" Another silence. This one heavier. "He's waiting for someone," Joshua finally said. "Someone he hasn't seen since he was admitted to your hospital. Thomas Avery." Emily froze. The name alone stirred an ache she didn't quite understand. Thomas Avery had been admitted 3 weeks earlier, heart failure, advanced, with complications that seemed to multiply overnight. A soft-spoken man, with sun-worn skin, calloused hands, and eyes that carried more years than his voice ever admitted. She remembered how he had mentioned a lion once in passing. "My boy," he'd said with a tired smile. But she'd assumed he spoke metaphorically, the way elderly patients sometimes reminisced. "Thomas?" she whispered. "Joshua, Thomas is in end-of-life care. He's barely conscious." "Yes," Joshua replied. "And Cairo knows. I swear he knows. Ever since Thomas stopped coming to visit, the lion has been different. Restless at first, then quiet, too quiet. He lies there staring toward the mountains. He won't respond to anything. We've never seen him act like this." Emily leaned back, her heart beating a little faster. Part of her wanted to dismiss it. Anthropomorphism, emotional projection. But another part remembered Thomas's trembling voice when he'd asked, "Has anyone called about Cairo?" even while barely able to breathe. "You're telling me," she said carefully, "that a full-grown lion is starving himself because he misses a human being?" "I'm telling you," Joshua answered, "that he's waiting for Thomas. And if Thomas doesn't see him soon, we may lose them both." The weight of those words settled over Emily like a thick blanket. She had witnessed strange connections before. Therapy dogs detecting seizures, horses sensing grief. But this was different. Wilder. Impossible. And yet something inside her stirred, a prickling along her arms, as if her instincts knew what her logic refused to accept. "Why are you calling me?" she asked softly. "Because," Joshua said, You're Thomas's doctor, and because he trusts you, I need your help figuring out what to do before it's too late." Emily closed her eyes, letting the quiet hum of the hospital fill the space between them. The idea sounded absurd. A lion waiting for a dying man, a creature built on instinct holding on to something that looked dangerously like love. She should have dismissed it outright. She should have told Joshua she couldn't help, but she couldn't ignore the tremble in his voice, or the strange, heavy certainty settling in her chest, one she didn't understand yet. "I'll come by after rounds," she said finally. "Don't make any decisions until then." "Thank you, Emily," Joshua breathed. "You may be the only one who can reach him." The call ended. Emily stared at her silent phone, the early light now creeping through the blinds. Somewhere in the mountains, a lion was waiting, and in room 217 upstairs, a man was fading. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt the uneasy sense that two lives, one human, one wild, were quietly moving toward a moment she wasn't prepared for, but would soon be forced to face. She rose from her desk, her pulse heavier than before, and made her way down the quiet hallway toward the elevator. The hospital at dawn had a strange stillness to it. Machines blinking in half-lit rooms, nurses whispering updates during shift change, the smell of antiseptics mixing with weak coffee. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped inside, feeling as though she were being pulled upward by something more than machinery. She braced herself as the doors opened to the second floor, where the soft beeping from room 217 echoed faintly through the corridor. Emily knocked gently and entered. Thomas Avery lay propped slightly against his pillows, skin pale, eyes closed, chest rising in slow, shallow waves. His chart clipped to the foot of the bed showed what she already knew. His heart was losing the strength to keep pace with his body's needs. 3 weeks ago, he'd still been talking, smiling, sharing old memories about his years rescuing wildlife. Now each breath seemed like a negotiation his body wasn't sure it could afford. "Good morning, Thomas," she said softly, adjusting the blanket around him. His eyelids fluttered, then opened just enough to recognize her. "Emily," he whispered, his voice thin but warm. "You're here early." "I wanted to check on you before rounds," she replied, though that wasn't the only reason. "How are you feeling today?" A faint breath of a laugh escaped him. "Like my heart's on its last shift and it didn't get the schedule." She smiled despite herself, because that was who he was. Gentle humor even on the edge of his final days. As she checked his pulse, she noticed his fingers twitch slightly against the sheets, as if searching for something. He closed his eyes again, and the room fell into a quiet rhythm. Her stethoscope, his breathing, the steady hum of the monitor. Then, almost too soft to hear, he murmured, "Any news?" Emily didn't need to ask what he meant. He had asked every day since he arrived. "Are you asking about Cairo?" she said gently. His eyes opened again, clearer this time. "Yes, I dreamed of him last night. He was calling for me." His voice trembled, not from fear but from longing, deep, old, bone-deep longing. "You know, I haven't missed a single week with him in almost 2 decades. Lions aren't supposed to get attached to humans. But Cairo," he trailed off, searching for strength. "He's different." Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She didn't want to burden him, but she also understood, instinctively, that withholding the truth would weigh heavier. She pulled the chair closer to his bedside. "Thomas," she said softly, "I got a call this morning, from Joshua." At the mention of the name, Thomas's eyes sharpened with concern. "What happened?" "He said Cairo hasn't eaten in days. He's barely drinking, and he's spending all his time in front of the enclosure fence, staring toward the mountains. They think," she swallowed, "they think he's waiting for you." Thomas blinked slowly. and for the first time in days, a tear formed in the corner of his eye. "My boy," he whispered. "He remembers." Emily placed a hand on the rail of the bed, steadying herself. "Joshua is worried, Thomas. He's asking what they should do. He thinks Cairo may not survive if—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The room grew silent except for the faint beeping of the heart monitor. The weight of the moment pressed into the walls, the windows, the morning light itself. Thomas closed his eyes, and a soft smile settled on his face, a smile filled with memories she couldn't see. "When I found him," he whispered, "he could barely stand. A cub with a broken leg and no mother. He should have died out there, but he didn't. He fought. I fought. And he grew into the strongest lion I ever knew." He paused, breaths shallow. "But strong hearts break too, Emily. Even his." She felt her throat tighten. It wasn't normal for her to be this affected by a patient's emotions, but something about this man, this lion, cracked open a door in her. She sat quietly, letting him gather his strength. "I should have gone back to see him," Thomas murmured. "I should have gone sooner. He doesn't understand why I disappeared." "You were too sick to travel," she said gently. "He wouldn't want you blaming yourself." Thomas lifted his gaze to hers, a flicker of urgency in his tired eyes. "Emily, I don't have much time. And he knows it. Animals know. They feel the things we hide from ourselves." His breathing hitched. "I just want to see him once more. Before—" His voice faded, lost in the hum of the machines. Emily reached out and rested her hand over his. His skin was cool, thin, fragile, like parchment stretched over memory and history. "We'll figure something out," she said, though the words felt heavier than any promise she'd ever made. Bringing a lion into a hospital was more than a violation of policy. It was unthinkable, but the image of Cairo lying motionless in his enclosure haunted her. She finished her exam and adjusted his oxygen flow, watching him drift toward sleep. When she stood to leave, he opened his eyes again one last time. "Emily," he whispered, "if anything happens, tell him I didn't leave him. Tell him I just ran out of time." Her breath caught. She nodded, unable to speak, then stepped quietly into the hallway. She leaned against the door for a moment, gathering the strength to keep moving, to keep thinking like a doctor instead of a witness to something larger than medicine. As she walked down toward the nurse's station, she felt the weight of two lives tied together by something wild and inexplicable, and she knew, without fully understanding how, that whatever happened next would test the limits of everything she believed about the line separating humans from the creatures they loved. Because somewhere in the mountains, a lion was waiting. And deep inside room 217, a man was preparing to say goodbye. Emily placed Thomas's chart on the counter, but her hands lingered, unable to let go. She stared down at the papers, seeing only pieces of a story that didn't fit together. Numbers declining, breaths shortening, the timeline of a man reaching his final chapter. Yet the image that pulled at her the hardest was not medical at all. It was the picture of a lion, starving himself in silence, staring toward the mountains, as if following a thread only he could sense. This wasn't something her training covered. No textbook had ever mentioned the possibility of a wild animal grieving the slow disappearance of its human caretaker. She barely had time to sort through her thoughts when her phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID read Joshua Reed. She stepped away from the counter, exhaling slowly before answering. "Joshua?" His voice came through heavy, frayed at the edges. "Emily, I'm sorry to call again so soon, but things have gotten worse. Cairo won't even stand up now. We had to move his water bowl within inches of him just to make sure he drinks anything at all. Emily walked toward the end of the hall where a window overlooked the mountains, distant, blue, and sprawling. "Has your veterinarian examined him?" she asked, though she already sensed the answer. "Yes, twice," Joshua replied. "There's no medical explanation, none. His heart rate is low, but his temperature is normal. No signs of infection, trauma, parasites, nothing that matches this kind of collapse." A moment passed before he continued, voice shaking slightly. "He's giving up, Emily. He's slipping away. And I'm afraid he won't last much longer." Emily pressed her palm against the cool glass. "What do you want me to do?" There was a breath on the other end, a heavy breath, the kind someone took before making a request they knew was unreasonable. "I want to bring him to the hospital," Joshua said, "to see Thomas." The words hung in the air like a shockwave. Even expecting something difficult, Emily wasn't prepared for the blunt certainty of it. "Joshua," she whispered, "that's impossible. This is a medical facility. We can't bring a full-grown lion into a hospital." "I know," he said. "Believe me, I know how it sounds. But Cairo isn't eating. He isn't moving. If we don't do something, he'll be gone before Thomas is. And I can't watch that happen. Not when I know what's causing it." Emily closed her eyes. "Even if I agreed, the administration won't allow it. There are safety protocols, liability rules, insurance restrictions. We've already started the paperwork," Joshua interrupted. "I wasn't going to call you unless we had a real chance. I contacted the director last night. She didn't dismiss it. She said she would consider a special request if you, as Thomas's attending physician, support it." Emily felt her pulse jump. "She wants my support?" "Yes, and we've reached out to legal. They're drawing up emergency liability waivers. We'd bring Cairo in through the service entrance at a time when no other patients are near that wing. 3 handlers plus our on-site vet. We'd secure every corridor." "Joshua, are you hearing yourself?" she whispered, stunned. "You're talking about sneaking a lion into a hospital." "No," he corrected her softly. "I'm talking about granting a dying man's final wish and saving the only creature in the world who has loved him without condition for nearly 20 years. Emily could hear something else beneath his words, a tremor of sorrow, fear, and conviction. This wasn't an impulsive request. It was the plea of a man who had watched too many animals die in the wild and wasn't willing to watch another fade away because of a broken bond. "What if something goes wrong?" she insisted. "What if he panics? What if—" "Emily," Joshua said gently, "Cairo wouldn't hurt Thomas. You know that. And if he sees him, just sees him, maybe he'll eat again. Maybe he'll fight to live." His voice softened further. "Isn't that worth trying?" Emily stepped back from the window, her breath tightening. She remembered Thomas's trembling smile earlier that morning. "Tell him I didn't leave him. Tell him I just ran out of time." The ache of those words twisted deeper inside her. She returned to the nurse's station, lowering her voice. "What time are you planning?" "We'd bring him at 2 a.m., Joshua replied. "No visitors, low staff, quiet halls. We take him straight to Thomas's room and straight back out. 15 minutes. That's all I'm asking." She felt her resolve slipping, not because the request made sense, but because the alternative felt unbearably cruel. A dying man and a dying lion, both wasting away in separate rooms, one of concrete, one of steel. When all they wanted was a final moment of connection. She paced slowly, the cold tile grounding her as she tried to think like a doctor, not a witness to a bond she didn't understand. Finally, she stopped. "I'll talk to the administrator," she said quietly. "But I'm not promising anything." "That's all I'm asking," Joshua breathed. "Thank you, Emily. Truly." When the call ended, she didn't move for a long time. The early morning sunlight crept softly along the floor, illuminating the corridor with a warm glow that felt out of place in the heaviness of her thoughts. The rules of medicine were clear, the ethics even clearer. But sometimes, she realized, life didn't bend to rules. Sometimes it bent to love, the wild, inexplicable kind that tethered a man to a lion across miles of mountains and years of memories. And now she was the one standing between them, not as a gatekeeper, but as the only path left. The decision weighed on Emily for the rest of the day, lingering behind every chart she reviewed and every patient she checked. The hospital bustled as it always did, nurses moving briskly from room to room, the cafeteria rattling with early lunch trays, visitors arriving in hushed clusters. Yet beneath the everyday noise, her mind kept circling back to the same impossible image, a lion walking down these very halls. She imagined the look on the night staff's faces, the tension, the uncertainty. And then she imagined Thomas, waking just enough to see the creature who had shared nearly 2 decades of his life. By mid-afternoon, she stood outside the administrator's office, heart beating faster than she wished. She raised her hand to knock, but the door opened before she touched it. Ms. Palmer, the administrator, stepped out, reading glasses perched on her head, a stack of files balanced against her side. "Emily," she said, "I was just about to page you. Come in for a minute." Inside, the office smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old books. Certificates lined the walls, photographs of charity dinners and hospital fundraisers neatly framed. Ms. Palmer set down her files and gestured for Emily to sit. "I assume this is about the wildlife refuge," the administrator said, steepling her fingers. "I received their request this morning." Emily nodded. "Joshua called me. It's an unusual situation." "That's an understatement." Ms. Palmer pulled a printed email from her desk. "They're asking to bring a lion, a very large lion, into my hospital." Emily swallowed. "Only under controlled conditions. Through the service entrance, after hours in a restricted wing. They'll bring handlers, a veterinarian, signed liability waivers." "I saw that." The administrator sighed. "It's still a considerable risk. Animals, especially wild animals, are unpredictable. And if anything were to happen—" "I understand," Emily said quickly. "But this isn't a publicity stunt. This isn't reckless. This is—" she searched for the right words. "This is a dying man's last connection. And that lion is dying too." Ms. Palmer studied her carefully. "You believe this is necessary medical support?" Emily hesitated. "It's not medical in the traditional sense, but it's something real, something I can't fully explain. Thomas's vitals respond when he thinks or speaks of Cairo. And the lion—" she paused. "Joshua says he won't survive another week." The administrator tapped her pen against her notebook, thinking. "You've always been a rational physician, Emily. Pragmatic, careful. It's unlike you to advocate for something so far outside policy." Emily looked down at her hands. "Because this is beyond medicine, beyond rules. I've seen patients hold on for final moments, final faces, final words. Maybe this lion understands that kind of waiting, and maybe Thomas deserves the chance to see him one last time." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the overhead light. Finally, Miss Palmer exhaled. "If you support this as his doctor, I'll sign the authorization, under strict conditions. 15 minutes, controlled access, only essential personnel present. If I sense even a whisper of danger, I'll cancel the entire plan immediately." Relief washed through Emily, though she kept her voice steady. "Thank you, truly." "You'll coordinate with security," the administrator said, "and inform your team. But be discreet. We don't need rumors starting among staff or visitors." Once outside the office, Emily leaned against the hallway wall, letting herself take one deep breath. She wasn't sure whether she was grateful for the approval or terrified by it. But either way, there was no turning back now. When her shift ended, she drove toward the mountains without thinking, letting the road curve upward through the pines, the landscape shifting from suburban calm to rugged wilderness. The refuge entrance appeared just as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, casting the valley into cooling shadows. She parked near the main lodge and spotted Joshua waiting by the wooden railing, his face drawn with fatigue. "You talked to her?" he asked the moment she stepped out of the car. "She approved it," Emily said quietly, "with conditions, and it has to happen at 2 o'clock tomorrow morning." Joshua closed his eyes with relief. "Thank God." Then his expression softened. "Emily, you may have saved both of them." "I don't know about that," she said, "but it's the best chance we have." "Come," he said, motioning for her to follow. "You should see him." They walked down a narrow path that led to a cluster of enclosures nestled among the trees. Evening light filtered through the branches, and the air carried a soft chill. As they approached the largest enclosure, Emily felt something tighten in her chest. Inside, Cairo lay near the fence, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his side. His once powerful body seemed smaller now, as though grief had carved away part of him. His golden mane, usually bright and full, appeared duller in the fading light. "He's been like this since yesterday," Joshua said quietly. "Barely moves, barely reacts." Emily stepped closer, stopping just short of the fence. The lion's eyes opened slowly, their amber depths reflecting something ancient and weary. He stared at her, not with aggression, not with fear, but with a searching, wordless question. "He knows who you are," Joshua murmured. "Thomas talked about you often when he visited. He said you were the only doctor who didn't rush him through his appointments." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. "Hi, Cairo," she whispered. "He's still here. He hasn't forgotten you." The lion blinked slowly, then lowered his head back to the ground with a soft, hollow sound that shook her more than any roar could have. As the last light of day slipped behind the mountains, she understood something she hadn't let herself admit before. This wasn't about rules or risk or even medicine anymore. It was about honoring a bond that had survived the impossible, a bond that deserved a chance to say goodbye. When she returned to her car, she glanced back one last time. Cairo hadn't moved. His silhouette rested against the earth as still as stone, waiting for a man who was running out of time. Tomorrow at 2 a.m., that wait would end, and nothing about the hospital, the mountain, or her own life would ever be the same again. The following day moved with a strange heaviness, as if the hospital itself understood something extraordinary was about to unfold. Emily went through her rounds with practiced calm, but beneath the routine pulsed a steady current of anticipation she couldn't shake. Every patient she checked, every chart she reviewed, every hallway she walked, everything echoed back to the quiet truth resting in her chest. Tonight, a lion would walk into room 217. By evening, the winter light outside had begun to fade, turning the windows into muted mirrors. Emily paused after finishing her final chart of the day and looked up the hallway where Thomas's room stood. The door was slightly ajar, letting a sliver of warm yellow glow spill into the dim corridor. She took a breath and walked toward it. Inside, Thomas lay silent, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. His breathing light, but a bit steadier than the day before. Helen, the night nurse assigned to him, adjusted his oxygen and glanced up at Emily with a small smile. "He's been calmer this afternoon," Helen said. "I don't know why. He seemed peaceful." Emily stepped closer to check his vitals. "Did he say anything?" "He didn't need to," Helen replied. He just kept looking at the window, like he's waiting for someone. Emily felt her heart tighten slightly. He is waiting with the same patience, the same ache, as the lion lying miles away in the mountains. She stayed with Thomas longer than usual, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. When she finally stood to leave, he stirred and slowly opened his eyes. "Is it time?" he whispered weakly. "Not yet," she said softly, "but soon." A faint smile touched his lips. "I'll stay awake." "You don't have to," she murmured. "I want to." His voice quivered, but his eyes held a familiar warmth. "I don't want to miss him." Emily swallowed and gently smoothed the blanket over him. She knew he didn't have the strength to stay awake long, but the determination lingering in his voice reminded her of a younger man, one who had spent years rescuing creatures who couldn't speak for themselves, one who had once carried a fragile lion cub through a snowstorm to safety. She checked the clock. Midnight, 2 hours. She walked to the security office next, where the hospital's overnight team gathered for the briefing she'd arranged. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Frank Norwood, stood at the front of the room, hands folded over a clipboard. "Okay, everyone," Frank began, addressing the team. "Dr. Hart will explain the situation." Emily stepped forward, aware of the curious and slightly alarmed faces staring back at her. "Thank you, Frank," she said. "Tonight, under controlled conditions, a team from Mountain Haven Wildlife Refuge will bring a lion, yes, a real lion, into the hospital for a brief visit with one of our hospice patients." The room erupted in whispers. She raised a hand for silence. "I know how it sounds, but we have full authorization from administration, signed liability waivers, and coordinated handlers who specialize in large predators. The patient is near end of life, and this visit is his final request." Frank cleared his throat. "Handlers will enter through the west service door. My team will secure all paths leading to room 217. Only essential personnel will be present." A nurse in the back raised her hand. "Should we be worried?" Emily shook her head. "Cairo has never harmed humans. He's calm, non-aggressive, elderly, and accompanied by experts. We've minimized the risk." Still, she felt the weight of her next words. "But we proceed carefully, quietly, and with respect. What's happening tonight is not an emergency. It's a moment of compassion." The security staff nodded, some more nervously than others. By 1:45 a.m., the hospital had fallen into its quietest state. The lights dimmed in the hallways, the hum of machinery seemed softer, and the building settled into a stillness that felt almost sacred. Emily walked toward the service entrance with Frank and 2 nurses, her pulse quickening with each step. At exactly 2:00 a.m., she heard the rumble of a vehicle outside. The handlers stepped into view first. 3 men in dark jackets, their movements steady and practiced. Behind them, emerging from the shadows like something from another world, was Cairo. Even prepared, Emily felt her breath catch. He was enormous, his shoulders towering, his mane brushed with silver strands that signaled age and wisdom more than power. Yet there was no fear in the way he moved, only a slow, deliberate grace. The handlers kept gentle hands near him, but Cairo needed no guidance. His eyes, deep and amber, fixed on Emily instantly. "He remembers your scent," one handler murmured, "from when Thomas brought him down for veterinary consults years ago." Emily nodded and stepped back to lead the way. The lion entered the hospital with surprising silence. His paws pressed softly against the floor, each step measured, almost reverent. The sterile white walls reflected his shadow, large and solemn, stretching long across the hallway as they approached room 217. Cairo paused outside the door. Inside, Thomas breathed faintly, unaware of the moment happening just feet away. Emily placed a hand on the doorframe and whispered, "He's ready." She opened the door. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp in the corner and the soft glow from the heart monitor. Thomas lay still, but a strange peace had settled over his features. It was as if part of him already knew what was coming. Cairo stepped inside. The handlers tensed, prepared to intervene at the slightest sign of agitation. But the lion moved with extraordinary calm, his gaze locked solely on Thomas. Each step seemed quieter than the last, until he reached the side of the bed. There Cairo stopped. Thomas stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and for a heartbeat, the world held perfectly still. "Cairo," he whispered. The lion lowered his massive head and gently pressed it against Thomas's chest, slowly, tenderly, as though greeting an old friend who had simply stepped out of the room for a moment. The heart monitor, so erratic for days, steadied instantly. A soft sound escaped Cairo's throat. Not a growl, not a rumble, but a low, trembling hum that resonated through the entire room. Emily's breath faltered. The nurses stood frozen. Even the handlers exchanged stunned looks. Because in that quiet hospital room, a lion was doing something no one expected. He was comforting a dying man. Thomas's trembling hand rose and sank into the mane he'd known since it was no larger than a handful of golden fluff. "My boy," he murmured, tears sliding down his cheeks. "You came." And in the stillness that followed, something deeper than medicine filled the room. A sense of devotion, of memory, of love that needed no words and no rules. For the first time in days, Thomas looked alive, and for the first time in days, Cairo stopped dying. The room seemed to hold its breath as lion and man rested against each other, their shared warmth softening the beeping of the monitors and the sterile chill of the hospital air. Cairo's massive frame curled gently along the side of the bed, his mane brushing against Thomas's shoulder. The faint sound of his slow, rhythmic breathing filled the room with a strange sense of peace, soothing, steady, alive. Emily could hardly look away. She had spent years studying human suffering, disease, decline, but she had never seen anything like this. A creature of the wild, feared for its strength, laying itself down like a guardian beside a frail old man. No textbooks covered this. No protocol accounted for it. Thomas's trembling fingers slid through the lion's mane. "You're still the same, boy," he whispered, barely louder than a breath. "Still gentle, still loyal." His voice cracked on the last word. "Still mine." Emily stepped closer to check his vitals, and for a moment she hesitated, not out of fear of Cairo, but out of respect for the quiet sanctity unfolding before her. The lion lifted his eyes toward her, and there was no threat there, only recognition, a silent acknowledgement, permission. She leaned in and saw something that nearly made her stumble. Thomas's heart rate had stabilized, his oxygen levels climbing several points higher than they'd been in days. Even his skin color had shifted to a healthier tone. It didn't reverse the inevitable, but it softened it, like a tide pulling back just long enough to offer a final calm. "Emily," Thomas murmured, still stroking Cairo's mane. "Thank you for letting this happen." She shook her head softly. "This wasn't about me, Thomas. This was about the two of you." "Even so," he whispered, "you believed. That's more than most would have done." Cairo chuffed quietly, nuzzling Thomas's chest with a tenderness that belied his size. The handlers stood near the door, astonished. Even they, who had spent years with Cairo, had never seen him act this way. Not with this gentleness, this care. Minutes passed, somewhere between 5 and 20, until finally Emily knew time was slipping too far. She stepped closer. "Thomas, we need to prepare to move Cairo back soon." Thomas nodded, though the motion was weak. I know, he whispered. Then, gathering a small thread of strength, he said, "But before you go, there's something I need to ask you. Something important." Emily pulled a chair closer to the bed, sensing the shift in the room. Thomas turned slightly, wincing, and reached toward his bedside drawer with a trembling hand. Emily quickly opened it for him. Inside was a sealed envelope with her name written in uneven script. "Open it," he said. She unsealed the envelope and found a notarized document inside. Legal signatures, stamps, official formatting. She scanned the title and felt her breath hitch. "Thomas, this is a request for compassionate discharge to home hospice at the refuge." He nodded slowly. "I don't want to die here. Not under these lights. Not with these beeps. Not away from him." Cairo nudged his arm gently, as if sensing the truth behind his words. "I want to go home. To my cabin. To the place Cairo grew up. To the place where he learned to trust the world again." Emily looked from Thomas to the document, then at Cairo, whose head rested protectively over Thomas's chest. She felt the room shift again, not physically, but in meaning. There was something sacred happening here, something unrepeatable. She could no longer cling to clinical reasoning alone. "This is all completely filled out," she said softly. "Signed, witnessed. Even the hospice arrangements. They've already been approved." "I had my lawyer prepare it months ago," Thomas whispered. "I knew the day would come. And I knew Cairo. He would need me close, for his sake and mine." Emotion tightened his voice, and for a moment he closed his eyes, gathering strength. "Please, Emily, help me get home. Help me finish my days the way I lived most of my life, close to the animals I dedicated everything to." Emily looked at him, then at Cairo. The lion's amber gaze met hers for a brief, soul-stilling moment. She felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Fate had placed her here, in this room, at this hour, beside this impossible bond. "I'll make the calls," she said finally, "and I'll do everything in my power to make it happen." Thomas exhaled, a deep, shaking breath of relief. Cairo responded with a soft rumble, pressing closer, as if understanding the promise made on his behalf. As Emily stepped out of the room to contact the hospice team and finalize transport, she saw something at the doorway that struck her. The handlers weren't tense anymore. They weren't watching Cairo for signs of danger. They were watching him the way someone watches a parent say goodbye to a child, or a child say goodbye to a parent. Reverence, respect, and something like awe. By the time Emily returned, Thomas had fallen asleep with Cairo still perched against him. The lion didn't move, not even a twitch. He stayed perfectly still, guarding the man who had saved him once, guarding him still, even as Thomas drifted further from wakefulness with every breath. Emily stood there silently, taking in the scene. This was not a story of a predator and its caretaker. This was not a spectacle. This was not a miracle or myth. It was love, simple, fierce, uncomplicated, the kind that stretched across species and time and circumstance, refusing to bend even at the edge of death. When she finally whispered that they had approval to move Thomas to the refuge in the morning, Cairo lifted his head just an inch, just enough to acknowledge her, as if he understood that his final duty was not to mourn, but to guide his friend home. The morning came quietly, wrapped in a pale Colorado haze that softened the towering pines beyond the hospital parking lot. By the time the medical transport arrived, the air still carried the chill of night. But inside room 217, a different warmth lingered, the kind that came from a man who had found peace in a way science couldn't measure. Thomas lay resting with Cairo beside him, the lion's head lifted just enough to track every movement around the bed. He had not taken his eyes off Thomas once since the night before. Emily approached gently, clipboard pressed to her chest more out of habit than necessity. Thomas, she whispered. It's time. His eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment he looked like a younger version of himself, a man who had once crossed rivers, climbed ridges, and nursed wild creatures back to life. Home? He asked, barely audible. Yes, she said. Home. Cairo rose slowly, stretching his tired muscles, then lowered his head to nuzzle Thomas's arm. The tender gesture sent a ripple of emotion through the room. Even the handlers paused, visibly moved. No one needed explanation. No one needed words. The connection was clear as breath. The transport team prepared the gurney. Emily, Helen, and the handlers worked with practiced quiet, careful not to disturb either man or lion. When they gently lifted Thomas, Cairo emitted a low, throaty rumble, not aggression, but concern, a protective warning. The handlers touched his mane gently. He'll follow, one murmured. He always does. The service hallway felt colder than usual as they wheeled Thomas through. Emily walked alongside the gurney, one hand resting lightly on the blanket near his shoulder. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was escorting more than a patient. She was escorting a story, an entire lifetime, toward its final setting. Cairo followed at a slow, deliberate pace, his paws touching the ground, with quiet purpose. Staff members stepped aside in stunned silence, hands over their mouths or clutching their ID badges, watching a scene they knew they would never witness again. A lion walking down a hospital corridor, calm, steady, and heartbreakingly dignified. At the service exit, the early sunlight washed over Cairo's mane, giving the silver strands a warm glow. When they lifted Thomas into the waiting ambulance, the lion stepped closer, as if memorizing every detail of the moment. Emily placed a hand gently on his head. He'll be right behind us, she promised. The handlers guided Cairo back to his transport crate, though they did not need to coax or restrain him. He entered willingly, eyes fixed on the ambulance the entire time. It was as if he understood the procession, understood the journey homeward. The drive up the mountain road took longer than usual. The winding gravel path demanded slow movement, but in truth, no one was in a hurry. The forest stretched out around them, deep green, hushed, alive with the soft crackle of morning. Emily sat beside Thomas in the back of the ambulance, monitoring his vitals even though she knew the machines mattered less now. What mattered was this: the quiet smile on his face as the familiar scent of pine drifted through the cracked window. "We're close," she whispered, squeezing his hand. He nodded faintly. "I can hear them." At first, she thought he was imagining it, but then she heard it too. Distant vocalizations echoing through the trees, deep, resonant calls, not frantic, not fearful, welcoming. As they passed the final bend, the sanctuary staff stood waiting by the main lodge, hands folded, faces lined with quiet reverence. Some had worked with Thomas for decades, others had been children when he founded the refuge, but all had been shaped, in some way, by his devotion to the creatures he protected. When the ambulance doors opened, a hush fell across the clearing. The staff stepped back respectfully as the gurney rolled down the ramp, and then, almost on cue, the lions in the distance called out again, their voices rising like a chorus carried by the wind. "They know," Thomas whispered, eyes glistening. "Animals always know." The handlers brought Cairo's crate beside the ambulance. The moment the door lifted, the lion stepped out with a soft thump against the earth. He scanned the faces around him briefly before turning his full attention to Thomas. His posture straightened, shoulders shifting with a mix of instinct and emotion. Then he glided, to the side of the gurney, pressing his head against Thomas's hand. The sight brought tears to more than one pair of eyes. The cabin waited just beyond a cluster of aspen trees, a modest structure with wide windows and a porch overlooking the enclosures. Emily had seen pictures, But they hadn't prepared her for the quiet beauty of the place, the way it seemed to belong to both wilderness and home. Inside, the hospice team had already set up medical equipment alongside Thomas's personal belongings. The old wooden shelves held books on conservation, faded photographs of wildlife expeditions, and sketches Thomas had made over the years of the animals he'd rehabilitated. But the most striking feature was the special passage door, reinforced, secure, yet unobtrusive, connecting the cabin to a safe section of Cairo's enclosure. Built years earlier when Thomas was still strong enough to work with the lion daily, it now stood as a bridge between two worlds. The staff transferred Thomas to his adjustable bed near the window. When they stepped back, Cairo approached the glass barrier on the other side of the passage. A handler pressed the release controls. Slowly, quietly, the safety locks disengaged. Cairo stepped through the open passage and entered the cabin. The lion moved straight to the bedside, lowering himself onto the wooden floor with a long exhale. His body curved protectively around the bed, as if reclaiming the role he had held for years: guardian, companion, silent sentinel. Emily stood by the porch entrance, watching. Helen set up the medication pump while whispering something gentle over Thomas's shoulder. Joshua stepped in, eyes misted with the weight of seeing his mentor home again. Thomas opened his eyes, taking in the surroundings: the cabin he loved, the mountains he called family, and the lion who had grown from a fragile cub into the creature lying beside him now. His hand drifted toward Cairo's mane. "Home," he breathed. The word rippled through the cabin like a blessing. Outside, the sanctuary quieted as if honoring the moment. Inside, Cairo pressed his head against the side of the bed, breathing in sync with the man who had given him a second chance at life. Thomas closed his eyes again. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Not ever again. Not while breath still lingered between them. And as the morning sun broke gently across the ridgeline, spilling golden light into the cabin, the journey they had begun decades earlier finally came full circle. Man and lion, together again where it all started. The cabin settled into a profound stillness, as if the mountains themselves had paused to witness the reunion. Light drifted softly across the wooden floorboards, catching dust motes that floated lazily in the beams of gold. Every corner of the room carried echoes of a lifetime: framed sketches of rescued animals, old hiking boots tucked beneath a bench, a weathered jacket still hanging near the door. Time seemed to fold inward here, blending the past and present until the boundaries no longer mattered. Emily stood near the window, watching the scene unfold with quiet awe. She had prepared herself for chaos, for uncertainty, for risk. But not for this. Not for the sight of a lion settling himself with such deliberate gentleness beside a dying man's bed. Not for the calm that radiated from both of them, anchoring the entire cabin in a peace she had never seen within a hospital's walls. Thomas opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream he hadn't wanted to leave. His gaze drifted to the passage door, where a faint draft moved through the short tunnel connecting the cabin to a secured section of Cairo's enclosure. The locks had been disengaged earlier at Emily's request, carefully, cautiously, allowing the lion to come and go on his own. "Is it open?" Thomas asked softly. Emily nodded. "Yes, you built it well." A faint smile touched his lips. "Took me forever, but I wanted him to have a way in whenever he needed me. Never thought I'd need it more than he would." Cairo shifted at the sound of Thomas's voice, lifting his head from the edge of the bed. His ears twitched as he listened to the gentle rasp of Thomas's breathing. The lion's amber eyes softened, carrying an intelligence that made Emily's chest ache. He placed one enormous paw lightly against the wooden frame of the bed, claws sheathed, the movement as controlled as a whisper. Helen, organizing medications near the small counter, paused to watch. "Never seen anything like that," she murmured. "Not even in all my years of hospice care." It's instinct, Joshua said quietly from the far side of the room. But not the kind people think lions have. This is loyalty. He exhaled shakily. This is knowing. Thomas reached toward the lion again, his hand trembling. Come here, boy. Cairo rose slowly and stepped closer, the boards creaking under his weight. His mane brushed Thomas's arm as he leaned in, lowering his massive head onto the bed with remarkable care. His breath rumbled in slow, steady waves that vibrated gently through the mattress. Thomas's fingers slipped into the thick fur and curled there weakly, holding on to life's last anchor. Emily approached to check his vitals. The monitor showed what her eyes already knew. His numbers were slipping, his body growing tired, but his distress seemed eased. For the first time since she'd met him, Thomas's face looked completely free of pain. Feels like he's holding me together, Thomas whispered, just like when he was young, scared, hungry. You held him together then, Emily said. It's his turn now. A tender silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of the oxygen concentrator and the soft sound of Cairo's breathing. Thomas blinked slowly. Emily, could you open the curtains a bit more? I want to see the ridge. She pulled them back, revealing the spread of pines, the glimmering slope of snow on the distant peaks, and the winding trail that led into the sanctuary grounds. Sunlight spilled into the cabin, brushing warmth along Thomas's face. Beautiful, he whispered. Haven't seen the mountains like this in months. You're exactly where you're meant to be, Emily said. He nodded slightly. And so is he. Cairo chuffed, a breathy, affectionate sound, and nudged his nose against Thomas's arm. Emily couldn't look away. She knew animals bonded with humans, but this was deeper, ancient, primal. This was a connection forged through years of shared survival. A soft sound echoed from the passage tunnel as the wind rustled through the metal frame. Cairo lifted his head, glancing toward it briefly, as if checking that no danger approached. Then he returned his gaze to Thomas, the protective instinct undeniable. Helen stepped forward to administer medication, but Cairo's ears flicked back. Emily raised a calming hand. It's okay, boy, she murmured. We're helping him. The lion's posture eased. Helen gently adjusted the infusion pump, careful not to disturb the lion. She moved with reverence, as though in the presence of something sacred. When she stepped back, Cairo's enormous head lowered again to rest near Thomas's hand. Thomas shifted, drawing a slightly deeper breath. Emily, he whispered, eyes half open. Do you know why I built that passage? She shook her head, waiting. Because I didn't want him to think I abandoned him. His voice trembled, brittle as pine bark. I knew, one day, I wouldn't be strong enough to go to him, so I gave him away, to come to me. The meaning settled on the room gently, like snowfall. Emily felt a tightness in her throat. He understood, Thomas. He really did. Thomas's eyes softened. I wasn't sure until now. Cairo shifted again, sitting up slightly. He pressed his forehead gently against Thomas's ribs, and Thomas let out a quiet, shaky laugh, the kind a person makes when overwhelmed by love and grief at the same time. You feel that? He whispered to Emily. That's not instinct. That's a soul. The words floated in the warm morning light, settling over everyone like truth carried on the wind. Even Joshua wiped at his eyes silently. Thomas's breaths grew slower, but peaceful. The cabin seemed to pulse with the gentle rhythm of man and lion, breathing in unison. The mountain breeze whispered through the slightly open window. Somewhere outside, distant calls from the sanctuary echoed softly, almost like a lullaby. Cairo stayed pressed against the bed, his body curved protectively around Thomas. creating a living shield against the cold and the fear that accompanied final days. Emily stepped back, sensing that what was happening now did not need monitoring or intervention or medicine. It needed presence. It needed silence. It needed the space between two beings who had saved each other long before this moment. As the sun climbed higher, spilling warmth across the bed and lion and man, Cairo lifted his head one last time and placed his paw gently on Thomas's blanket-covered leg. A gesture so careful, so deliberate. It drew tears from Helen's eyes. It was a promise, a vow, the unspoken language of a bond unbroken. And in that sacred moment, the cabin, half refuge, half farewell, became a bridge between worlds, where love moved quietly through the passage Thomas had built, and Cairo now kept watch over. As the hours passed, the gentle warmth of morning faded into the muted glow of afternoon. The light shifted across the cabin floor in long, peaceful bands, illuminating the subtle dusting of snow that had begun falling outside. The world beyond the windows seemed wrapped in silence, as if the mountains themselves were listening. Inside, the rhythm of the cabin matched the slowing rhythm of Thomas's breaths, softer now, thinner, like a flame flickering low but refusing to go out. Cairo had not moved more than a few inches. His body remained pressed close to the bed, one massive paw draped lightly over the blanket. Every few minutes, he lifted his head to study Thomas's face with a focus that felt almost human. There was worry in his eyes, though the lion made no sound, only that slow, deliberate breathing that kept time with the deepening quiet. Emily checked Thomas's vitals, though she no longer needed the monitor to tell her what her eyes understood. His heartbeat had grown faint but steady, like the distant echo of a drum. She glanced at Helen, who gave her a soft, knowing nod, one that hospice nurses offered when they sensed a life slipping gently toward its final hours. "He's comfortable," Helen whispered, adjusting the pillows with practiced tenderness. "That's all we can ask for now." Joshua stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, but not out of authority, out of helplessness. The lines around his eyes seemed heavier than they had earlier that morning. He stared at Thomas, then at Cairo, and shook his head softly. "I've seen this lion through every season," he said quietly, "but I've never seen him like this, not even when he was injured as a cub." "He knows," Emily said, "maybe more than any of us." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the trees, sending a swirl of snowflakes drifting past the cabin window. The fire in the small wood stove crackled steadily, filling the room with a soft, comforting glow. It painted shadows across the walls, shadows of two forms intertwined, a man and a lion. Thomas stirred slightly, and Cairo responded instantly. He raised his head, ears perked, leaning closer to the bed. Thomas's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then slowly turning toward the lion's silhouette. "You're still here," he breathed, voice barely more than a whisper. Cairo shifted closer, resting his chin on the mattress. Emily watched as Thomas's frail hand reached toward him, fingers shaking with effort. The lion lowered his head even more, pressing into that hand with reverence that made Emily's chest tighten. "Good boy," Thomas murmured. "My brave boy." Emily stepped closer to check on him, but stopped when Thomas's eyes flicked toward her. "Thank you for letting him come home," he said. "You belong here," she replied softly. "Both of you." He managed a faint smile. "I should have known he'd stay by my side till the end." Cairo chuffed softly, almost like an answer. It wasn't quite a growl nor a purr. It was something gentler, something that vibrated through the wooden floorboards and into the air. The handlers who had been waiting quietly on the porch poked their heads in, drawn by the sound, but stayed back, unwilling to intrude. Thomas's breathing began to change, a pattern Emily recognized from her years of working with terminal patients. It was the body's final attempt to hold on, A soft rise, a long fall, then a pause that lingered just a moment too long. Cairo sensed it too. He shifted, drawing closer to the bed, resting his head against Thomas's arm, eyes locked onto his face. The lion's mane brushed against Thomas's cheek, and the old man let out a trembling breath. "You were never meant to survive that winter," he murmured. "But you did, and I'm so proud of you." Emily felt her throat tighten. She remembered the story Thomas had told her. Finding a half-frozen cub between two fallen logs, carrying him for miles, sleeping beside him so he could feel warmth again. That cub, now grown, had returned all those years of devotion in a single, unbroken vigil. Minutes stretched. The daylight outside dimmed further as clouds gathered overhead, casting the cabin into a soft, gray twilight. The sound of distant lions calling echoed faintly across the sanctuary, their voices low and resonant, an ancient chorus acknowledging one of their own. Inside, time moved differently, slower, heavier. Thomas's breaths grew shallow. Cairo lowered his head fully onto the bed, his body drawn tight with concern. His tail rested motionless along the floor, his eyes unblinking. "Emily," Thomas whispered. She stepped to his side. "I'm here." His eyes, clouded with exhaustion, found hers with surprising clarity. "When it happens, promise me you'll stay with him. Make sure he isn't alone." "You have my word," she said, and she meant it more deeply than she'd meant anything in her career. He closed his eyes again, his body relaxing beneath the blankets. A long silence followed. Emily checked his pulse gently, noting the faint flutter beneath her fingertips. She looked at the monitor. The numbers dipped, stabilized, dipped again. Cairo lifted his head slowly, his breath brushing against Thomas's cheek. His ears flicked back, a low vibration moving through his body. He nudged Thomas's arm, gentle but urgent. "He's aware," Helen whispered. "He knows Thomas is fading." Emily nodded, unable to speak. The moment was so intimate, so profound, that it felt wrong to break it with anything louder than breath. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, pulling the world into a single point: the man, the lion, and the fading thread that held them together. Thomas's breaths came slower now, softer. The kind of breaths that weren't meant to last long. The slow dimming had begun. And Cairo, old, loyal, devoted, kept watch with eyes that held both the memory of a cub and the sorrow of a creature who understood exactly what was being taken from him. He leaned closer to Thomas, as if trying to lend him strength from his own body, refusing to let him slip away without feeling the comfort of the one soul who still needed him. The light continued to fade, the breaths continued to slow, and the bond between them, impossibly strong, held firm in the quietest hour of the day. Night began to fold itself over the sanctuary, the last traces of daylight disappearing behind the ridge until only a muted blue-gray glow remained. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a soft, unbroken blanket across the ground outside the cabin. The sky above was heavy with clouds, the moon hidden, as if the heavens themselves were waiting, watching, holding their breath along with everyone inside. Emily pulled a chair closer to the bed, knowing she wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. Helen stood quietly at the medication table, her hands steady but her shoulders sinking with the weight of what she felt coming. Joshua lingered by the porch doorway, arms crossed against his chest, eyes fixed on Thomas as though memorizing every small movement, every fragile rise and fall of his chest. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly in the stove, casting warm shadows across the walls. Shadows of antlers mounted decades ago, old photographs of mountain rescues, and wooden carvings Thomas had made long ago when his hands were still steady. It all felt like a museum of the life he had lived, each item holding a fragment of memory that refused to fade. Cairo shifted his weight, pressing his body closer to the bed. Not aggressively, not even protectively. More like a child instinctively reaching for warmth in the dark. His nose brushed Thomas's forearm, and the old man responded with a faint sigh, a fragile acknowledgement that he still felt the lion near him. Emily leaned forward. "Thomas," she whispered, "can you hear me?" He opened his eyes, but only halfway. "Still here," he murmured. His voice was thin, fading, like a thread stretched too tight. "It's all right," she said softly. "We're right here with you. You're not alone." Cairo chuffed, a soft, breathy sound Emily had come to understand as affection. He lowered his head until it rested against the mattress again, his eyes half closed, but his body taut, alert to every change in Thomas's breathing. A sudden gust of winter wind swept across the clearing outside, rattling the cabin windows. The sound was deep, almost haunting, and it made the trees sway in slow motion. Emily shivered despite herself. The wind felt different tonight, heavier, more deliberate, like a warning carried from the ridge. Thomas's breathing hitched once, then steadied in the way that precedes a deeper decline. Helen noticed it too. She stepped beside Emily and lowered her voice. "He's entering the final stage. It could be hours or minutes." Joshua stepped inside fully, closing the porch door with careful quiet. "Should we call anyone?" he asked gently. Thomas heard him. "No," he whispered. "Just you three and him." The lion lifted his head again, the amber in his eyes catching the dim cabin light. He didn't look away from Thomas, not once. Emily squeezed Thomas's hand. His fingers were cold, but the pressure he returned was unmistakable. Weak, fading, but present. "The ridge," he whispered. "Open the window a bit." Emily moved to the window, unlatching the side panel just enough to let in a thin ribbon of icy mountain air. It drifted across the room, bringing with it the distant scent of pine and earth. The sanctuary beyond lay silent, save for the occasional rustle of branches. And then, a single lion call echoed in the distance, low, deep, prolonged, like a song carried through miles of wilderness. Cairo lifted his head in response, ears perked, gaze turning toward the window as his muscles tightened. He listened intently, then released a low rumble that trembled through the cabin floor. "They're calling for him," Joshua said quietly. "No," Thomas whispered. "They're calling for us." Emily felt her chest tighten. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sorrow. It was understanding. As if something older than any of them, older than the cabin, older than the mountains, had settled into the room and made itself known. Helen stepped forward to check Thomas's oxygen. "He's losing strength," she said softly. "The body's letting go." Thomas's eyes fluttered open one last time. "Emily," he murmured, "come closer." She did. "I'm here." "You've been good to him," he whispered. "Promise me. Promise you'll help him when I'm gone." Her voice cracked. "I promise." "And promise," he paused, taking a shallow breath. "Promise you'll watch the ridge at dawn. You'll see." "See what?" she asked, tears gathering. His lips curved faintly. "The mountains don't hide farewells." Cairo lowered his head again, brushing his mane against Thomas's cheek as the old man's fingers tangled weakly in the thick fur. The lion lingered there, breathing softly, almost as if trying to synchronize his heart with the fading rhythm beneath his chin. Thunder rumbled far in the distance, not loud, but enough to vibrate through the floorboards. The cabins in these mountains were no strangers to sudden storms, but this felt different, as though the earth itself was acknowledging the moment. Thomas inhaled slowly, deeply, one of his last strong breaths. "It's time," he whispered. Emily felt her heart break with those two small words. The cabin fell completely silent. Even the fire seemed to dim. Cairo straightened slightly, eyes locked on Thomas's face, his breath trembling with each exhale. He let out a low, melodic hum, so gentle, so unlike anything a lion should be capable of, that Helen pressed her hand to her mouth to hold back a sob. It was a sound of comfort, a sound of devotion, a sound of sorrow. Thomas's breathing grew even slower. A long inhale, a long exhale, then a pause. His fingers slipped from Cairo's mane. Emily leaned forward, listening closely, her chest tightening. Another shallow breath came, then another, barely there. She looked at Helen, who nodded solemnly. "It won't be long." Joshua turned away, wiping his eyes beneath the brim of his cap. Cairo didn't move. He stared at Thomas with an intensity that bordered on reverence. His body curled protectively around the bed. His tail lay still, stretched across the floor like an anchor. The night deepened. The wind grew quiet. And the waiting began. For life to fade. For love to hold. And for the dawn to bring whatever truth the mountains had promised. But dawn did not come. Not yet. The cabin remained wrapped in the kind of darkness that felt deeper than night. A silent hush that pressed itself into the walls, the floorboards, the very air. Emily could hear every shift in the room with startling clarity. The soft crackle of the fire, the gentle hum of the oxygen machine, the nearly imperceptible rasp of Thomas's breaths. And beneath it all, like a heartbeat that belonged to the wild itself, she heard Cairo's low, steady rumble. The lion had not moved an inch. His body curled around the bed, muscles coiled, breath warm against Thomas's pale arm. His eyes, those deep amber eyes that once scanned the African plains before fate brought him to these mountains, remained fixed on Thomas's face. He knew. They all knew. This night was the last. Emily checked Thomas's pulse again, though part of her already felt the truth sinking into her chest. His pulse was faint, thready, fading like the final notes of a distant song. His breaths came in slow waves, a long inhale followed by a longer exhale, each one weaker than the last. Helen stood by the foot of the bed, tissues clutched in her hand, her usually steady expression softened into sorrow. She had been by the bedside of hundreds of patients in their final moments, but this one was different. This one had a witness no human could ever replace. Joshua hovered by the window, arms folded tight, jaw clenched. He stared out at the dark sanctuary grounds, as if expecting the mountains to speak. And in a way, they did. For the wind had quieted completely, and even the distant lions had fallen silent, as though honoring what was about to unfold. Thomas drew in a fragile breath. "Cairo," he whispered, barely audible. The lion's ears twitched. He lifted his head slowly, so slowly it felt ceremonial, and leaned closer until his forehead touched Thomas's shoulder. Emily felt the moment crack through her like lightning. She had never seen an animal behave like this. Not with this intention. Not with this sacred gentleness. Thomas's lips parted. "I'm here," he breathed, though the strength behind the words had almost vanished. "I'm right here, my boy." Then it happened. Cairo made a sound unlike anything any of them had ever heard. Not a roar, not a growl, not even the soft chuff he used to greet caretakers. This sound was almost mournful, low, hollow, drawn from a place deeper than instinct. It trembled, rising and falling like a melody carried by an old soul. Emily's breath caught. Helen pressed a hand to her chest. Joshua took a step forward before freezing in place. The lion was crying. Not in human tears, not in human language, but in a sound so raw and heartfelt that it pierced the room with unbearable tenderness. It filled the cabin with a weight that no one dared disturb. Thomas's eyes opened just a little, and for one moment, just one, clarity returned. He lifted a trembling hand and rested it in the lion's mane, fingers brushing the coarse fur he knew as well as his own skin. "Easy," he whispered. "It's all right." Cairo answered with another low, shaking rumble. His body pressed close, as if the contact could anchor Thomas to the earth for just a little longer. Emily leaned in, tears burning at the edges of her vision. "Thomas," she whispered, "we're right here." He nodded, or perhaps it was just the faint tilt of his head. His breaths came slower now, softer, each one a little lighter than the last, like feathers drifting to the ground. Then came the change, the unmistakable shift Emily had seen countless times, the body's final gathering of strength before letting go. Thomas inhaled, deeper than before, his chest rising with one last attempt at fullness. His fingers tightened weakly in Cairo's mane. His eyes fluttered open. He looked at Emily, then Joshua, then Helen, and finally at Cairo, as if memorizing their faces. And then he exhaled, a long, quiet sigh, one that carried decades of love, sacrifice, and the wild places he had devoted his life to protecting. The heart monitor issued a steadily flattening tone. Emily leaned in instinctively, but before she could move, something extraordinary happened. Cairo rose, not in panic, not in fear, not in aggression. He stood slowly, deliberately, and placed one massive paw on the edge of the bed, leaning forward until his forehead rested gently against Thomas's. The entire cabin fell silent. The lion remained there, eyes closed, breathing deeply, as though trying to share his own heartbeat with the man who no longer had one. The gesture was so intentional, so unbearably intimate, that Emily felt her knees weaken. She had expected grief. She had expected confusion, but not this, not a final goodbye. Minutes passed. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Cairo stayed pressed against Thomas's still form, his breath slowing into a deep, rhythmic hum. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, through the bed frame, through Emily's chest. It was a sound of mourning, of reverence, of a bond that stretched beyond life. Finally, Cairo lifted his head and looked at them. His eyes glistened, not with tears, but with something older, something ancient. Then, with the dignity of a king and the fragility of a grieving child, he curled his body beside Thomas, laying his head across the man's chest, just as he had so many times before. Emily covered her mouth to stop the sob that escaped. Helen turned away, shoulders shaking. Joshua lowered his head, removing his hat out of respect. A lion had said goodbye to his benefactor. A moment so powerful, so true, it seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. And outside, as if on cue, a soft wind picked up. Gentle, warm, carrying with it the faintest hint of dawn. The mountains had kept their promise, and the world, for one breathless moment, stood completely still. In the dim cabin light, time felt suspended, as if the night itself refused to move forward out of respect for the man who had just taken his final breath. Thomas Avery lay motionless on the bed, his face softened by a peace that had eluded him for months. Beside him, curled like a sentinel carved from the earth, Cairo remained pressed against the still chest, breathing slow, deep breaths that shook faintly with each exhale. The lion did not move. He did not roar. He simply stayed. Emily's hand trembled as she reached forward to silence the flatline on the monitor. The long, steady tone dissolved into quiet, giving space to a deeper, older silence, one woven out of grief, reverence, and the weight of something larger than any of them. Helen stepped closer, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. She touched Thomas's hand in farewell, whispering a prayer under her breath. Joshua removed his hat and placed it against his chest, eyes locked on the scene before him. "He went just the way he wanted," Joshua whispered, "with his boy." But Cairo did not rise at the sound of their voices. He stayed curled against Thomas, head draped across the man's ribs, as though listening for a heartbeat he could no longer find. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. The storm outside had eased, leaving only the faint rustle of the trees. Snow fell in thin, quiet sheets, softening the sanctuary grounds into a blanket of white. Through the window, the sky was turning a muted gray-blue, the earliest hint of dawn creeping up the horizon. Emily stepped toward the bed again, unsure whether to intervene. "Should we?" she whispered. "No," Joshua said gently. "Let him have this. Let him say goodbye in his own way." Helen nodded, wiping her eyes. "He understands loss. You can see it. He needs time." They gave it to him. For nearly 3 hours, no one disturbed the lion. Emily sat quietly in the wooden chair by the window, watching the first streaks of daylight touch the treetops. The cabin was warm, the fire burning low, the air thick with the smell of pine and the quiet presence of two souls, one gone, one grieving. As the light brightened, something shifted in Cairo. His ears twitched first. Then his deep, resonant breathing grew slower. He lifted his head from Thomas's chest with heavy reluctance. His movements were slow, as if gravity itself had doubled around him. He pressed his nose gently against Thomas's still hand, once, twice, before resting his forehead against it. A final blessing. A final recognition. Emily felt her eyes fill again. After a long moment, the lion rose. Not with the fluid grace he once had, but with the stiff, aching motion of an old creature carrying a weight that had finally become too heavy. He did not look at anyone in the room, not out of disregard, but because his focus remained solely on the man he had loved with unwavering loyalty. He turned toward the passage door, pausing only once to look back, his amber eyes shimmering with something Emily had never seen in an animal before. Grief. Deep, knowing grief. Cairo stepped through the passage and disappeared into the adjoining enclosure without a single sound. Helen pressed a hand to her chest. "Lord, he knew. He really, truly knew." Joshua stepped forward and covered Thomas with a blanket up to his shoulders, his hands shaking. "We'll honor every wish he made," he whispered hoarsely. "Everything he wanted for this place, and for Cairo." Emily took a slow breath and reached for her stethoscope out of habit, even though she already knew what she would find. She checked Thomas one last time, then gently closed his eyes. The moment was quiet, tender, final. Later that morning, staff from the sanctuary arrived to help prepare Thomas's body according to his instructions. No fanfare, no crowds, just the people he trusted most. They laid him in a simple wooden casket made from reclaimed timber, adorned only with pine branches and a single carved panel depicting a mountain lion. The sun had risen fully by then, warming the snow-covered grounds. Emily followed the procession outside, her boots crunching softly in the fresh powder. The air smelled of cold earth and memory. The burial site was a peaceful clearing near a tall cluster of aspens, a place Thomas used to hike to when he needed solitude. He had chosen it years ago, not for its beauty, but because it overlooked the lion enclosures. He had always wanted to rest where he could still hear the calls of the creatures he loved. As the ceremony began, A familiar sound cut through the air. A low, solitary call. Cairo. Emily turned toward the ridge. In the clearing beyond, just inside the fence line, Cairo sat on his haunches facing them. His mane rippled in the cold breeze, his posture tall and still. He did not roar. He did not pace. He simply watched, his gaze fixed on Thomas's final resting place. And somehow, that single presence, the lion holding silent vigil, felt like the strongest eulogy any creature could offer. The staff lowered the casket into the ground. Helen wiped her cheeks again. Joshua whispered something nobody else could hear. Cairo remained until the last shovel of earth was placed. Days passed, then weeks. Winter thawed into a soft early spring. Visitors arrived at the sanctuary, and life moved forward as it must. But Cairo's routine changed in ways none of them expected. He stopped roaming the full breadth of his enclosure. He stopped vocalizing with the other lions. He spent hours, sometimes entire afternoons, sitting quietly near the cabin, staring at the empty bed visible through the window. He was not distressed, not agitated, not sick, just remembering. And on a gentle spring morning, nearly a year after Thomas's passing, Emily received a call from Joshua. She drove up the mountain, heart heavy even before she arrived. They found Cairo lying in the grassy clearing beside the cabin, his body relaxed, his breath still. He had passed in his sleep. No struggle, no fear. He had chosen the very spot where he and Thomas shared their final days. They buried him beneath a great oak tree, one Thomas had planted long ago, its roots stretching deep into the earth, its branches reaching toward the mountains he loved. Emily placed her hand on the fresh mound of earth and whispered, "You kept your promise too, old friend." And as the wind moved through the trees, she could almost feel it, the echo of a bond that had defied every boundary between man and beast, lingering in the mountains where their stories had always belonged. If this moment touched your heart even a little, just drop a simple 1 in the comments so I know you're here, feeling this story with me. And if you'd like to walk beside us through more journeys like this, stories of loyalty, courage, and the wild hearts that change us, make sure you subscribe and stay with the channel. There's so much more waiting to be told.